Story 1. Around 25 years ago, not long after we moved into a rental house in a quiet rural Virginia town, I decided to explore the area behind our property. It was wild land, overgrown brush, and trees that hadn't been touched in years. Just past there was an old quarry filled with water. The locals said the quarry was dangerous. They warned that if you stepped into it, the drop was sudden 60 feet straight down, and you'd be swallowed by the dark water without a chance to come back up. Even though it creeped me out, my sister and I used to roam the area all the time. One afternoon, while wandering along the side of the quarry, I stumbled across something strange. There on the ground was an old backpack, dirty, and from being left out in the elements for who knows how long. The zippers were rusted and the fabric was weather-worn. Curious, I opened it up. Inside I found several PS1 CDs. All of them scratched and worn, like they had been tossed aside and forgotten. It immediately struck me as odd. This was 2000, and even though the PS1 was old, by then most kids still held on to their games because they were expensive in a town like ours, where most families didn't have much money. Video games were a big deal. No one would leave them lying around like this. Next to the backpack was a set of clothes spread out on the ground in a way that gave me chills. The pants and shirt were laid out perfectly, as if someone had been lying in them and just disappeared. It didn't look random, it felt deliberate. The clothes were soaked and faded, with the kind of wear that comes from sitting through seasons of rain and sun. I stared at them for a moment, trying to make sense of what I was seeing there. No backpacker, no camper, no sign that anyone had been living in the area. Just the old clothes laid out like an empty person and a backpack full of outdated games. I felt uneasy, like I had interrupted something. Like I wasn't supposed to be there. I didn't stick around for long. I ran back home and told my parents what I'd found. At first they thought I was probably imagining things or overreacting. But when I described the way the clothes were arranged, they decided to call the police. Just to be safe. The officers arrived later that day and I led them back to the spot. Everything was still exactly where I had found it. The cops searched the area for a while. But they didn't find anything else. No footprints, no signs of a camp or anyone living out there. They collected the backpack and clothes and asked around the neighborhood. But no one had heard anything about anyone going missing. Our neighbors were mostly elderly, and there hadn't been any missing person reports in years. No adults, no children. It didn't make sense for it to be a prank either. People around here didn't have much money, and I couldn't imagine anyone wasting their PS1 games like that. It was as if the things had just been left there waiting to be found. The cops never searched the quarry, since they had no reason to believe a crime had been committed. They didn't see a need to drag the water. They told us they'd run the items through their system, but we never heard anything back. No matches, no follow-ups, just silence. The whole thing felt like it had been swept under the rug. My sister and I both felt the same way. It was just wrong. Something about it creeped us out. Even though nothing more ever happened. As far as I know, we left there after a year. Whatever was out there and whatever story those clothes and CDs held was never solved. Story 2. Back around 2007, I was living near my college in an apartment tucked back from the main road. The whole complex sat in a wooded, hilly area, far enough away from traffic to feel a bit isolated. I loved running, and most evenings I'd go for a jog around the neighborhood. Usually just before sundown. It was the perfect way to clear my head. One night, near the end of my run, I was making my way up the last hill behind my apartment. It was getting darker, but I knew this area well and wasn't too worried. As I approached the base of the hill, I glanced ahead to the top and noticed 3 guys on bikes just sitting there, lined up and facing in my direction. Immediately my senses started tingling. Something about the way they were just sitting there completely still, not moving or talking, made me uneasy. As a 20-year-old woman alone, it set off every alarm bell in my brain. I shook it off and kept running. But the further I climbed up the hill, the worse the pit in my stomach grew. The guys hadn't moved an inch. They were still sitting there facing me as if they were waiting. I didn't have my phone on me. Just shorts, a tank top, and a pair of running shoes. There was nowhere else to go. No detours or alternate routes. It was either push forward or turn back, and going back would take me further from home. I tried to focus on my breathing and keep my head down. But the fear was clawing its way to the surface. Then just as I was halfway up the hill, I heard movement beside me. My heart jumped into my throat. I whipped my head to the right, and that's when I saw him. A German shepherd running stride for stride with me. I had never seen this dog before. No collar, no owner in sight, just this big muscular shepherd appearing out of nowhere. I can't explain it, but the second I saw him, this wave of calm washed over me. It was like some part of me knew I'd be okay now. He stayed right beside me, matching my pace perfectly. I didn't stop or slow down, I just kept running with him right there, as if he belonged to me. As we got closer to the top of the hill, the guys on the bikes came into full view. That's when the dog did something strange. Instead of staying by my side, he surged ahead, moving just slightly in front of me. Then as we reached the three guys, the dog planted himself directly in front of me, positioning himself between me and them. He didn't growl or bark, he just stood there solid as a wall, blocking their path. I kept my eyes straight ahead and didn't make any effort to look at the guys. I could feel them watching me. But I wasn't about to stop or slow down. With the dog in front, I passed the group without a word, keeping my focus on the road ahead. We just kept running. When I reached the entrance to my apartment's parking lot, a brightly lit area that felt safe, the dog slowed down, almost as if he knew his job was done. I turned to say thank you, or at least get a better look at him. But before I could, he slipped into the trees beside the parking lot and disappeared. It was like he had come out of nowhere and now he was gone just as quickly. I stayed in the parking lot for a minute, catching my breath and trying to wrap my head around what had just happened. I felt like I had been in danger, and somehow this dog had shown up at exactly the right moment to protect me. Story 3. This happened when I was 12. No one in my family will acknowledge it except my grandparents. My family owns a cabin in Cook's Forest, Claren, Pennsylvania, built by my granddad. A few other properties are scattered nearby, but most are further up the hill. Along the road, only one was close to us. A partially visible lot halfway down the hill that had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. The lot contained the remains of a crumbling cabin built into the hillside, with a concrete basement exposed on one side. It was familiar, almost comforting in its stillness. We passed it often, whether riding ATVs or walking down the trail. That familiarity changed one Memorial Day. It was a family tradition to gather at the cabin every year after winter. I woke up the first morning expecting to hear the chatter of adults downstairs. Instead, I woke to silence. I thought maybe I'd woken up too early. But when I got downstairs, it was immediately clear that something was off. The adults were outside in a semicircle talking to a man and a woman I didn't recognize. The couple looked polished, standing out against the rustic setting. I assumed it was some adult business and went to wake my cousins. On my way back upstairs, I glanced at the clock on the microwave. It was 3 p.m. That didn't make sense. I was always too excited to sleep late at the cabin, and 3 p.m. was absurd. I woke my cousins and waited for the adults to come back inside. Eventually the kitchen came alive with activity as my granddad fired up the stove to make pancakes, and the tension seemed to ease. But when I asked my aunt, who was usually all smiles, she was pale and nervous. She took me outside and pointed to the abandoned lot halfway down the hill. Except it wasn't abandoned anymore. In its place stood a sprawling cabin mansion, gleaming and out of place in the quiet forest. The parking area was filled with shiny SUVs and the coolest four-wheelers I had ever seen. My aunt explained that the couple I saw earlier were the new owners, and they had invited us to come over and meet their nieces and nephews, who were also visiting for the weekend. The adults acted like everything was normal, but the atmosphere was thick with unease. Then my aunt looked me dead in the eye and asked, "Did you see that cabin last year or last month? Did you see any construction?" She was right. There had been no sign of activity on that lot. I had spent years at the cabin riding past that abandoned property, and it had always been the same, crumbling, empty, lifeless. My aunt's words were enough to make me pause. But I still didn't understand the tension. The owners seemed polite enough. That night, my granddad, who rarely showed fear, was loading shotguns. He handed one to my uncle. My normally gentle grandmother quietly pulled a pistol out of her purse and kept it within reach. When I asked why they were arming themselves, I was met with non-answers and a quick reassurance to stay inside the cabin. I remember lying in bed. The next morning I woke to the familiar smell of pancakes and the sound of adults chatting in the kitchen. I feel relieved that things seem back to normal. I ran downstairs only to be hit with another wave of confusion. The microwave clock read 7:30 a.m., but my aunt insisted that it was Saturday morning. I froze. Yesterday had been Saturday. I had woken up at 3 p.m. to a day that felt off-kilter only for everything to reset as if it had never happened. I ran outside to confirm what I already suspected: the abandoned lot was back to its usual decrepit state. The mansion was gone, as were the SUVs and the four-wheelers. I tried to ask my aunt about it again, but her dismissive tone shut me down. "You must have had a weird dream," she said.